Wonderful to see you as always. Really looking forward to this session. You bring a wealth of experience across lots of elements of corporate, Fox Sports, news, an entrepreneur, very involved and ingrained in the tech space, on a number of boards. And really, I think we're sitting here, we highlighted some of the perceived challenges in my opening keynote, and we've had some challenges and solutions in the last panel. And the reason for putting this here was to, I guess, kind of help the audience say, well, what's coming around the corner? We see lots of negativity and challenges of recessions coming and other things that we don't need to really dwell on right now, but it's challenging times, and you take a real look in terms of a macroeconomic look, what's happening in the world, and I think we've decided that we're going to kind of break this down into 5 different areas of capital. We're going to touch on political capital, we'll talk about social capital, economic, environmental, and institutional. And which one would you like to kick off with?
Maybe just set some context, right?
Yeah.
I think 2 things. I think it's always darkest before dawn, and we've seen from the unicorns of the last decade, whether it's Airbnb or Netflix, or businesses get formed and reformed during recessions. In a sporting context, it's no different than preseason training. If preseason training does not hurt you, the second half of your season, you're going to suffer because you aren't training hard enough, as an analogy. That's my first point. I think my second point, from a historical context perspective, I don't believe sport has ever had as expansive, as immediate, and as accessible a role to have an impact in society as in this decade.
Yeah.
The scale and speed and sophistication is similar to Europe and club football and association football after the Second World War of the 1950s. That was continental. If you look at the 1980s recession after the 2 oil crises, and if you look at countries like Australia, tremendous investment, and then you suddenly had, rugby, cricket, tennis significantly coming out in the 90s and the noughties, and similarly in the former sort of Soviet accession states and the Baltics and the Balkans in terms of tennis and the NBA and golf. So I think it's not all doom and gloom. I think as I said, it's darkest before dawn, and for those of us who get up before dawn and put in 10 miles before the sun comes out, I think it's a good thing for us. Coming on to your point about the capital, the suggestion that I had around capital, I think economic capital is something all of us have been familiar with. It's fundamentally about a return on investment. I think the difference, though, this time is there's an expectation from governments and from citizens for sport to create a GDP impact far more than events. Whether you're looking at sports technology, whether you're looking at wellness, which Caroline and I are going to speak about later this evening, or whether we talk about sustainability, which we'll talk about on the environmental capital. There are 2 or 3 vistas of economic capital whose returns and scale are far larger than your sort of discounted cash flow of an event, right? So let's start in the economic capital. Political capital is interesting. There are 2 parts to it. I think the industry, and I think somebody made the point earlier around how state-owned enterprises and the public sector has a very large role to play. I think there's an expectation from an institution perspective, such as yourselves, race organizers, industry folks, on government providing subsidies and support. There's also an expectation from sporting citizens, around the fact that there's a certain right to have access to facilities. There's a certain right to have access to information. There's a certain right to be part of a community. It's no different than the air we breathe and the water we drink. That's political capital. Social capital is around inclusion. Whether you're looking at Me Too, whether you're looking at Black Lives Matter, there's a whole debate going on around gender and gender choice. I think the degree of inclusiveness that sport has been able to cultivate is very, very high. And then environmental, of course, the UN SDGs.
So let's just pick up on that one, because you see more and more of that happening in mainstream sport, in inverted commas. You have star athletes that are coming out and supporting different causes, being front and center, football stars,
Yeah.
rugby stars, the golfers, the like. In our industry, we have, so many of the recreational athletes, and at the pointy end, we have a few of these amazing elite athletes who tend to be, more often than not, quiet, demure, shy participants who leave their talking on the race course.
Yeah.
Some ideas about this industry being able to harness that and make, Mike touched on it on the panel from an organizer perspective, but how do we bring the ecosystem into championing that and creating opportunities?
Yeah. I think if you think about it from an individual perspective and societal capital, whether it's Naomi Osaka, LeBron James, Marcus Rashford, as the case might be, it's top down. I think for the demographic of what you call, demure yet determined runners, I think there's tremendous scope for bottom up. I think hashtags on social media, a very simple thing like a hashtag.
Yeah.
The bucket challenge on Facebook, as we know 5 years ago, I'm definitely a Facebook generation, not TikTok. I think that can have a virality and an inclusiveness and a camaraderie, which is no different than, getting somebody across the 20-mile barrier. So I think hashtags and social is very, very important. It's location agnostic, it's language agnostic, it's gender agnostic, it's economic agnostic. So I think that to me is a very important part. I think the collective value of events, like you said very beautifully, that back in the day you would do your customer acquisition towards the end. Your customer acquisition would start towards the end of somebody else's race. There's no reason why race promoters can align and come together. I think collective bargaining, whether it's the NBA in the US or whether it's European clubs and the Serie A and the Premier League, they strengthen numbers. So again, it comes back to my point about there is a degree of individual empowerment, the degree of institutional capital. Institutions don't have to be large.
Yeah.
Great point. I'm on the board of a charity called the Go Sports Foundation in Bangalore. We began 15 years ago. An overnight sensation takes a decade to build.
Yeah.
We had 34 athletes in Tokyo, a dozen medals. We're going to have 54 in Paris. But it takes a while, and then the groundswell takes over, and then beyond that, the hockey stick has its own momentum.
That's a great story, the Go Sports story, and tie that back in then to the point you were making before about government. So we have this kind of expectation in some parts of the world that government should support the event, they should give the grants. I was talking to Dave Cundy yesterday, who's obviously a passionate supporter of this industry, and he was saying, am I wanting my taxpayer money to be going and closing roads for a select few who are running? How do you kind of meld that together, that expectation that government supports, the multiple balls that governments are juggling, particularly now post-COVID, where money's been spent on solving the pandemic and supporting it, expectations of citizens? Talk a little bit around that, if you will.
Fascinating question. There's no clear answer. I'll start there.
Oh, come on. You promised me you'd have the clear answers.
I think there's contextual answers.
Yep.
I think contextual answers differ whether you're a city-state like Singapore, whether you are a rich metro like a Paris or a Tokyo or a New York, as opposed to whether you are a one-state dominated country like Java in Indonesia, or dare I say California in the US. Right? I think, again, this context, that's one.
Yeah.
Because then you're looking at federal taxes, state taxes, sort of municipal taxes. That's one answer.
Yeah.
I think the second answer is there's a gap between government entities and parastatal and not-for-profit organizations to bridge the gap. Again, on your panel, there was conversations around community. There's a large part of Western civilization, because of the peacetime infrastructure and importance of leisure, that allows people to have the habit of volunteering. In the emerging markets where going and coming can take 3 hours on a weekend and you commute 10 hours a week anyway, there are certain reasons why the domestic might take the child to an activity rather than the parent taking the child to activity. Yes. But again, if you reduce those friction points and make it far more parochial, far more neighborhood orientated, the commute goes away. So that's again down to institutional capital. There's no reason why we do this with our daughter, who's a big basketball fan. We play 5-on-5, but we also play 3-on-3. And the kind of relationships built when playing 3-on-3 with the parents and the kids in the condo is very different compared to fast break on a Saturday training and Sunday matches. So I'm saying there are pockets of how you actually create and collaborate rather than actually saying. Now coming back to your point about expectation, it's like a teenage child. They want all the autonomy, none of the responsibility. I think in times when they are tight, you can have open conversations. It's very easy to have an open conversation about responsibility when times are tight with someone who wants something, because it's a seller's market, it's not a buyer's market. In times are good, it's very hard to have adult conversations because the other party has got options.
Busy. Yeah.
So I'm giving you an answer, but I'm saying two things. A, it's contextual.
Yeah.
And B, within the context, it depends on what is it that you're seeking. Are you seeking to meet what is a perceived unmet need?
Yeah.
In which case you try and say, okay, for me to meet this unmet need, what do you bring to the table? Now, today, tomorrow, next week, next year. Fine, let's have that conversation. Rather than saying, oh my God, I'm so poor, help me out.
Yeah.
There are sections of society, unfortunately, who need that, and that's not a conversation at all. I think it comes in the middle of the ambiguity where people have and want a bit more, which is fine. It's not a need, but a want. Fine with that, so long as they know that for you to get it, somebody else has been denied it. And therefore, you need to make good on what's been given to you. It's a subtle conversation, but it needs to be had, and it will always be had in tough circumstances rather than easy circumstances. You always look at your post-match analysis after you've lost.
Yes.
You never look at it when you won.
Yeah.
We are entering that kind of a period.
That's a wonderful analogy. So in terms of then the leadership of that conversation, so let's take a step back to Go Sport.
Yeah.
That was an idea that was catalyzed by a charity fundamentally, and then the government kind of came on, or did you go to the government? I'm just interested here. Much of this industry sits here saying, how do we bring the government to the table? Where does the leadership of that happen?
It's a great case study. So the Go Sports Foundation is a society and a charity. It does not get any government funding. It's entirely donor-driven. Donations at an institutional level are through CSR budgets, so they have CSR guidelines, reporting, etc., etc. Individual budgets, on a personal account perspective, have got no criteria in terms of statutory obligations of reporting. It's more courtesy and obligations. That's my first point. The second point is it began with Nandan Kamath, who to my mind is perhaps amongst the most eminent sports lawyers, I would say, not only in India, but in Asia. Rhodes Scholar, better batsman than me, which hurts. Harvard Law, worked in the Bay Area, came back. And his law practice began 8 months before the IPL started. And 4 out of the 8 franchises became his clients. Off he goes. He said, okay, so now what? I'm seeing institutional pieces. So he began it out of his extra office room. He began the foundation through his own money. For 18 months, he self-funded it. Then from there, somebody said, I want to help you. Then from there, the CSR policy coincidentally got passed by the government. That rolled out opening doors to institutions who already knew at a personal, professional level that there's this vehicle called the Go Sports Foundation to which I can allocate part of my CSR. So partly serendipity, partly happenstance, partly circumstance. And then today, it's gone from, when I joined the organization, it was 34 athletes. Today, it's 216. Having conversations at Rio was very different from the conversations we had in Tokyo to the conversations we're having in Paris. 2 things have changed. Mental health has become front and center, and coaches and the support staff have become front and center. So to your point, it's not only athletes who we are looking to support, but it's also the support staff. Because the ability of a coach to impact a multitude of players is far, far more in the grand scheme of things than one athlete.
Yeah, that whole multiplier.
So to re-emphasize, it's donor-based completely. It's grown incrementally and organically. We haven't pushed it. But the one thing that the foundation has sought to always do is try to be ahead of the curve, to your point about what's coming around the corner. We were the first to address mental health. We were the first to address physical disability, what we call differently abled.
Yes.
And we were the first to address gender in a country like India, where the social taboos are very different. And others have taken it on. We are fine with that. It's more about stoking and shaping the conversation.
It's wonderful. And again, if I bring that back to the industry, there's some sectors where we sit here and say, why isn't the government supporting us? You are, some people could say, doing a job that should be done by a Ministry of Sport or whatever, and you've achieved an enormous amount that some people might say, why isn't the government doing this responsibility? And again, tying it back to some people that might be sitting here saying, we need to bring the government to the table. There is this opportunity to achieve amazing things.
So again, 2 or 3 things. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. It's not a question of A or B. I think everyone has a role to play.
Yep.
That's one, right? 2, I did not start off helping, this is a purely pro bono commitment to this organization with the expectation of riches. I keep saying to them, forget the Olympics, think of the Asian Games, think of the Commonwealth Games, think of the National Games. Because if you don't think about these 3 or 4, in 5 years' time, you can't think about the Olympic Games.
Yeah.
You know, you've got to be incremental. That's very important. I think to your point in terms of time, you know, I probably gave anything between, I would say, 150 to 200 hours a year to the foundation. That's about 4 hours a week.
Yeah.
That typically is half a day in industrial time spent. And if you, I'm a strategic advisor, I run an agency and consulting practice. If you put an hourly rate on that, that's a significant amount of money. But I think the amount of satisfaction that you get, I think Caroline or somebody mentioned it earlier about, or the volunteerism, how volunteerism actually gives you energy, sense of purpose. You know, Stuart spoke about purpose. It really feeds you.
Yeah.
You also learn and you stay in touch with what's happening with the TikTok generation. But lastly, I think there's a sense of purpose. We've been tremendously lucky, Chris, you and I. We have enjoyed 25 years of the media rights bull run in this industry, where you and I know, we don't have to go on record, you and I know we've got 50% more or 5x more of a deal we expected simply because there was competition in the market and we had a scarce resource. But that was not the reason we joined. We joined because we love sport and then we went on a journey.
Yeah.
But I think it's very important to sort of make sure you give back. And there's no reason to start earlier. It's very, very important.
That's a great point. Let's, time ticks away. Let's go on to, where do you want to go next? Environment, maybe?
So we spoke about economic capital,
Yeah,
pretty
yeah.
clear. Political capital, pretty clear. Social capital, pretty clear. I think environmental is very interesting. You know, so a bit about, so Pictureboard Partners is a very small sort of niche advisory business. We do agency sales, we do sort of strategy and for advocacy, and we look at venture development and capital raising. Over the last, every year, I give myself a word to think about over the next 12 months, which I know the year after is going to come in vogue. This year was blockchain. That's how late I am. Last year it was sustainability.
Okay.
And you know, we've been able to sort of work out what sustainability means for our organization and for our partners and for our clients. Sustainability is fundamentally 3 pillars in our view. One is facilities. Stadiums, running tracks, as the case might be, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff around there, which is electricity, water, power, all that kind of stuff. Second is materials, apparel, footwear, equipment, all that kind of stuff. Third is events, F&B, carbon neutral, and how you go from there. So again, just thinking through, I think that is a good framework to start thinking about what ESG means for us. I think in sport, it's far easier to think about the E and the S. The G is murky, so I would park it for the first half of this decade. The governance part in sport is soft because they're member organizations. Democracy, as we know, has got pros and cons. Accountability is hard. So I would park the governance piece. I very much look at environment and society in the first half of this decade because that prepares the foundation for the governance piece in the second half of this decade, which will come, and it will not be driven organically. It will be driven by the Gen Zs who value governance as a right. So that'll come, you know, it's not going to be a question of, if not bread, give them cakes. There's going to be stuff in the Tuileries.
Forced on.
It'll happen, right? You're going to be forced on by the market.
Yeah.
And then institutional capital is similar to the Go Sports Foundation, similar to your starting Mass Participation Asia, similar to GSIC, similar to other organizations which are fundamentally trying to create their own niche for their own sustenance, very important, but also their own share of giving back in the ecosystem. Because as you said in your keynote, collaboration is key. So I think leadership like institutional capital is not hierarchical. Management leadership is hierarchical. Thought leadership and action-based leadership is not hierarchical. Our 12-year-old child teaches us a lot more on a daily basis than us who are not that old. You know, so I think institutional involvement is akin to leadership, which is a non-hierarchical concept. It can start from a street corner, or it can be from the cabinet office. And ideally, you want to have a bottom-up, top-down coming together.
Yeah. Love that, love that. Let's talk about, in our planning conversation, you spoke about the differences between East and West. We've got a very wide audience here, East, West, North, South. Talk a little bit about like that, some of the things we spoke about on our call in terms of the differences and the similarities and potentially the opportunities as we inevitably swing a little bit more East.
Yeah, I think there are 3 things very important. I think one, you know, I live in Singapore. Within a 5-hour flying radius of Singapore is the next billion fans of this decade. You know, it's a very different, it's very heterogeneous. It's a bit like Europe. It's very, very heterogeneous, religions, languages, cultures, all that kind of stuff, regulation, all that kind of stuff. But there are certain elements which bind that billion universe. I think mobile centricity is one of them, definitely. I think micropayments is another one of them. I think thirdly, a sense of pride articulated through sporting prowess. Much of Asia has never been proud about its sporting achievements. In the West, it's a second or a third generational instinct. So, if you have a Western entity or IP which is coming east, I think mobile centricity, a degree of being able to actually provide for a sense of identity in a very positive light, and in a way that you do that so that the heterogeneity actually is your strength rather than a hindrance would be the lens. I would even say, even if I get 10% of a billion, even if I get 1% of a billion, 10 million people is 2 Singapores. 10 million people is London. And the per capita net worth is quite high. So I think it's a very interesting time. I think also one last point, I think for a long time there's been a sort of a bipolar view between the East being emerging markets and the West being mature markets. I think that's changing. There's a demographic change in the West, there's a demographic change in the East, if you take a sort of a long-term piece. Within the East, cities like Bombay or Singapore are on par with Tokyo and Melbourne and Korea and Seoul in terms of purchasing power parity. So there are islands within the emerging markets which are very mature, very developed. So your model doesn't have to be one size fits all. It again needs to be contextualized and nuanced.
Yeah, and you keep coming back to that context, which is so important. And again, talking about, I think you said identity. So, Indonesia going and winning a World Cup, or Japan in a Rugby World Cup, the way that they emerged was amazing. But in a running parlance, that identity actually potentially comes down to the individual level, isn't it? It's that, this, I'm doing it for my health and well-being, but I'm a marathoner, I'm a triathlete. That brings that identity to people.
I was speaking to a surgeon in Singapore 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about Joseph Schooling and the growth of rotator cuff injuries in the shoulder. Because it wasn't people taking up swimming, it was people taking up butterfly swimming.
Okay.
Talk about role models, right?
Yeah.
Joseph Schooling.
Give a bit of background of
Joseph Schooling famously
know.
beat Michael Phelps, and I forget whether it was a 50 or the 100-meter butterfly. I may be wrong. I think the butterfly was the event. It was in Rio. The country came to a standstill, and then ever since then, swimming and specifically butterfly has become very important, to the extent that there are not enough surgeons to look after rotator cuff injuries in shoulders in Singapore. But this shows the role of role models. It also shows the thirst of the citizenry to come good.
Yeah.
And in a country where you're lucky to have facilities like Singapore, every condo has a pool, community centers have got a pool, the weather is conducive, et cetera, it's a very, very important part. But I think that the identity piece is very interesting. One more nuance on that. 10 years ago, so Abhinav Bindra, who won a shooting gold at Beijing, is on the board of the Go Sports Foundation. Been very privileged to spend time with him. He said, when I came back to India, I was treated more than a Bollywood star, a cricketing star, in 2008, right? When Neeraj Chopra came back from Tokyo having won the javelin gold, it wasn't that much. Because in the meantime, we had the franchise economy of the IPL, which had come in. And today, we actually have heroes at two different levels. They're national team heroes, but they're also franchise players who don't play for the national team who are heroes. It takes only a decade for alternative notions of identity to come in.
Yeah.
So to say it's only national identity is a start, and then from there you go into teams, from there you go into individual players, from there you go into institutions. And a decade is not a long time. A decade is not a long time.
And that's playing out, isn't it, in your mainstream sports, where the younger fans no longer support a team, they support a player.
Yeah.
So my young son's a Messi fan, Sam, and the Barcelona is in the bottom of the cupboard now. He's now walking around in PSG because he's a Messi fan. He's also, of course, has to be a Liverpool fan because Dad is, but it kind of goes there. We got a little bit of time, maybe 6 minutes. Let's move on to tech. I mean, that's a big space of yours. Talk about what you see coming, the opportunities, and you're obviously involved with GSIC.
Sure.
You're going to be involved in a panel this afternoon talking about Web3 and the metaverse. But in this context, what are some takeaways that you can leave us with?
I guess someone's got to be on a panel for Web3 and metaverse, so that's fine. I give back, as I said. This morning I'm taking, and I'm going to give back post-lunch. Again, the way I tend to look at it is, again, over a decade. What are the main 4 or 5 technologies of this decade, rather than looking back? So, video compression, grid computing, I would say even cloud, data networks were the technologies of the last decade. This decade's around blockchain, computer vision, mixed reality, machine learning, you go from that. I think that's one way of sort of laying the ground rules a bit. And I think Raj will probably share a slide when we sort of set up about, but these are the engines of growth of the new ecosystem. I think the second distinction to make is, are you creating a solution for an existing problem, or have you built something cool looking to find a problem to solve? Which is so when I do work with entrepreneurs, tremendous difference between an entrepreneur who is in his mid-20s, early 30s, as opposed to someone, who's worked a decade, and then she is looking to sort of do something to solve a problem that she's been facing in her day-to-day life. And then she finds partners to do something mid-30s onwards. You've been 15 years in the industry, you want to see life change as well, so there's that piece to it. So, try to address the problem and then try and solve it rather than create a solution which you believe will find this problem eventually. That's the second point. I think the third point is we're coming off a decade of cheap capital. There's been a tremendous opioid addiction of B2C, direct-to-consumer businesses, which you can feed on Facebook and all that kind of stuff. The only people who win are the platforms. Your VCs don't win, your business doesn't win, the customer definitely doesn't win. If B2C was that easy, then being a shopkeeper would not that be hard, but it is. I think the focus on B2B, especially from a sports tech perspective, there's a lot more friction points that we can solve for our industry. And again, like I frame technology across the 5 technologies of this decade, I tend to sort of look at sports tech across 3 dimensions: on pitch, off pitch, and along pitch. Right? So on pitch is very much high performance, off pitch is all your storytelling, and along pitch is fundamentally off the pitch but in the stadia. So very much your ERP and running a facility and the business side of it, which is very B2B, whereas off pitch is very B2C. So, enterprise vis-a-vis consumer, on pitch, off pitch, along pitch, and make sure that you sort of decide that there is actually a problem. It's very easy to fool yourself that there's a gap in the market and not think about the fact that there's a market in that gap. It's very easy to do that. So easiest person to fool is yourself. Just look in the mirror.
Folks, we've got a couple of minutes. Would anyone like to ask a question of Unmish?
I think they've had enough.
Any questions? Had enough? Okay, we got about 2 minutes. What's your final key takeaway as you talk to this audience? And you're not immersed in this audience, but you've been a supporter of MPW since day one in Singapore.
Chris,
you've been
we've
to many
known
of these.
each other more than a decade. And we didn't get off to a great start.
Back when we had hair, huh?
I didn't have a forehead, now I have a forehead. And we didn't get off to a good start. I was at Fox, we were looking to buy Cycle Singapore and the entire business. Peter Hutton, who was my then boss, my first boss, and then my boss again, he was till recently at Facebook, loved the idea. But I must say, what you've done for the industry for the last 10 years, what you continue to do selflessly, it's not easy. I also work for myself. It's not easy, mate. But what you do in a very focused, methodical, sort of collaborative manner is not easy. I do hope someday I get that wisdom. I definitely have the drive and the intellect. I don't think I have the wisdom, but hopefully I'll get there. So all I'd like to say is what you do, I hope we can support you and have supported you enough. I think we're probably on chapter 2 or 3 of a 10-chapter book. And I think that, with every passing year, I think by 2028, I think LA will be a very different sporting economy, especially for mass participation and track and field and marathon. But I think I echo the sentiment in this room and in this industry way beyond where we are today to thank you for all the work you've done. So if I can please ask you to put your hands together for Chris Robb.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Sorry, you've left me a bit stumbled.
I'm full of surprises.
I wasn't expecting that.
I'm not a foregone conclusion. I never was, never will be. So look, there you go.
So I'm going to follow, to wrap that up, a bit of a theme of where I started this morning is what are the problems we're solving, and you've reinforced that for me. You can look at all of the different capitals we've spoken about: political, social, economic, environmental, institutional. But if you're trying to solve a problem that's not really there, as I think Stuart said, if you think you're organising just a race, you might not be in business. That key takeaway: identify a problem, and are we now solving the problem that we were solving 10 years ago?
There's never a good time to start until a crisis hits. Right? I think this morning you very visually and very, it was very humbling. You showed us that less than 10% are below the age of 30 in this Haloed forum. When we began speaking about the metaverse panel with Jim and Raj last night, we were like, yeah, I'm not quite sure what the audience is going to be. But no, I think this afternoon is going to be different. I think we have to challenge ourselves to think through how can we engage Sam? How can we engage Anaika, who's 6 and 12, to make sure that they actually come forward and do something? They have the desire. It's just that the means, as Stuart was saying, are very different. I think it's really on to us to be able to recalibrate the how and the who, as opposed to the what and the why.
Love it. Great way to finish.
No worries, mate. Thank you so much.
Wonderful to see you, as always.
Thank you.
Thank you.